Get ready for a topic only we have the balls to cover. Hello and welcome back to Meet Mozart. I'm Angie, that's Mozart, and today we are getting into one of the most disturbing yet fascinating topics in the history of opera, which is the castrati. So what is a castrato, and why would that ever have been a desirable thing? So a castrato, as the name suggests, is a male that has been castrated, meaning that without going into too much medical detail, he has had his testicles removed. Now, why would anyone ever want to do that or volunteer their sons to have this procedure done? Well, we have to look at the time and the place in history in which this practice became the most popular. And that is Italy from about the 1500s into the early 1800s. And there were many reasons for this, but one of the primary ones was that at that time, women were not allowed to perform in church. And according to the mood of the Pope at the time, they often weren't even allowed to perform on stage in the opera houses. And so that left a huge gap in the musical experience that needed to be filled, especially because the most popular voices of the time were higher voices like sopranos and altos. So how did musicians fill this gap? They used boy sopranos. And a boy soprano was great, but the problem was that eventually they would stop being both a boy and a soprano, and so they would either turn into tenors or basses, or even worse, they would stop singing altogether. A castrated boy, however, could ideally, and I say ideally because that did not work out well for everyone, maintain that soprano range. And on top of keeping that higher range, they could potentially, and again I say potentially because it didn't work out for everyone, develop a vocal sound that was unearthly. It was a sound that combined the purity of a child's voice with the range of a woman and the power of a man. And the Italians went nuts for it. Now, it's important to note that castrati, or eunuchs as they were usually known, existed a long time before this period in Italy. And they were a part of many different cultures in many different religions for many different reasons since almost the dawn of time. But this is the first and only time in history that castration methods were used in the service of music. The craze for castrati went all through Europe, except for sort of France, who kind of seemed to not appreciate it. They found the sound very unnatural and it bothered them. So it didn't really go over quite as well in France. But everywhere else in Europe loved the castrato sound. Of course, the hub for castration and the education of these young men was in Italy. And here's what their journey would have looked like. If you were a young boy who had a nice voice and showed some sort of musical talent, a music instructor might go to your parents and say, listen, your kid, I think they got what it takes to become a great castrato. And if they did become a great castrato, then that would mean they performed in churches and opera houses and for kings and queens, and they would go up the rungs of society. Now, to us as modern listeners, we would hear that and just think this is crazy. Absolutely not, and we would never let that happen to our children. But if you were a poor family in Italy in the 1600s who didn't have enough money, who had far too many mouths to feed, you might look at that as an opportunity or a sliver of a chance to give your child a better life than you could offer. And for that, you might be willing to have them suffer a little bit of mutilation. If the procedure was successful and the child survived, because let's face it, it was being done in a lot of barber shops with all of the modern sterilization techniques of the 1600s, then they would go on to music school. The music schools that supported and trained the castrati were run by the Catholic Church, who officially condemned castration, but did everything they could to support the education and develop the careers of pretty much every castrato. So, hypocrisy aside, however, these schools were officially considered orphanages, in which the student body usually consisted of the castrati, male true orphans, and then also some students who actually paid to attend. And when we actually talk about the amazingness of these castrati, while it is true that by having this operation performed, they developed differently, their vocal cords were much smaller, and so that's why they still sounded like children. And yet, as they grew, actually their rib cages grew extra large, even bigger than most men's. And so that's what really contributed to their unique vocal quality. But on top of this unique sound, they also had extensive musical training with some of the best singing teachers of the time. Their vocal training began mainly with breathing, and they would focus on developing their breath in their body. And once that was more fully developed, they would begin working with the more popular ornamentation styles of the time. So they would work on things like trills or the messa di voce, which is a special skill of taking a single note and then swelling that note so that it begins very soft, goes to a louder volume, and then goes back to being soft, all on a single note and a single breath. Once the castrati became better trained in these ornamentation styles, then, and only then, were they allowed to sing even a simple melody. And so in training in this way, not only did they become great singers, but they became great at improvisation. And so if you heard a great castrato perform, they could take the same aria, sing the same piece over 10 times in a row, and every time they could add little improvisations into the ornamentation so that with each time it would be like hearing a new piece in a way. And each time you heard it, there would be some exciting and new experience involved in it. And so between this great music education and these unique voices, this was really what was the whole package for the castrati. Once they reached a certain point in their training, these castrati were hired out by the schools for different performances, such as festivals or funerals. And once they finished their studies, they would continue working either in churches or opera houses. And once they reached a high level within the opera houses, the world sort of started to open up to them. And they were hired on by kings and queens and dignitaries. In fact, there's a really great story about Farinelli, who is the uncontested greatest castrato of all time, who had reached a certain amount of fame in the opera houses, and because of that, he was called on to help in Spain. Philip V of Spain was having a really difficult time. He was the king, he was depressed, and he wasn't really functioning. And so his wife, the queen, brought in Farinelli to sing for him in order to try to raise his spirits. And it worked. And actually, Farinelli became so close to the king and queen that he actually became a political advisor and spent the majority of his career working with them in Spain. Although the castrati often began their operatic careers singing the roles of the women characters, the ultimate dream and the ultimate test of fame was to get to sing the leading man roles. For this reason, operas of that time period tend to feature a lot of high voices. And so women or soprano castrati would cover the female soprano roles, and the castrati, who were usually altos, would cover the leading male roles. Tenors and basses were generally used either as bad guys or smaller supporting roles. As we've mentioned in some of the other videos, the popular themes for operas at this time were Greek mythology or history that would have been familiar to everyone. So, for example, an opera about Caesar. And this was really the part about it that the French could not really wrap their mind around. They couldn't conceive the idea of a macho man like Caesar, conqueror of the world, being represented by someone who sounded like and often used the gestures that were very feminine, like a woman. This trend continued to sweep across Europe, and young men continued to be castrated well into the 1800s. However, as the cultural mentality started to shift and we moved into the Romantic era and people desired more realistic characterizations in opera, composers stopped writing pieces that were designed for castrati. And so most of them only continued to sing in church until that was eventually banned in 1902. As for the schools that supported and educated these individuals, after the glory days of the castrati, they became quite mismanaged. They weren't able to bring in great teachers anymore, and in fact, they even started bringing in instrumentalists to train the singers instead, and so that really affected the quality of the students coming out of these schools, and they eventually closed around the late 1700s. So with castrati being a thing of the past, what does that mean for modern performers? Well, obviously there were a lot of works that were created at that time that were great, but unfortunately we have no way of presenting those pieces the way the original audiences would have heard them. So therefore, roles like the title role in Handel's Giulio Cesare have to be performed either by countertenors, who are men that have developed that head voice, that upper register, so that they can sing all of the higher notes, or by women who are mezzos or contraltos. And they would be playing something sort of like a pants role, which even beyond the age of the castrati, women playing pants roles is something that has actually stayed as a practice in some operas, although since the castrati, it's generally been used as a way to characterize young boys or teenagers. Although we'll never get to hear these pieces the way that they originally premiered, we do have one recording of a castrato from the early 1900s, and I'm going to go ahead and place a link to that in the description below. Now, keep in mind when you listen to it that this is a recording from approximately 200 years after the prime glory days of the castrati. And so while it might give us an idea of a general timbre, it's not really going to show all of the same training and musicality that the castrati had when audiences heard them in the 16 and 1700s. Alright, so that wraps up our discussion on the castrati. If you're really fascinated in this subject and you want to learn a little bit more, I highly recommend checking out Patrick Barbier's book, The World of the Castrati. It gives a much fuller picture of their life and the society that surrounded them. And it also tells some really great stories about these musical giants. In the meantime, however, you know what to do. Please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, push all the fun buttons, including that little notification bell so you don't miss our next video. And we will see you next time.